You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple.
Welcome to Sweet Talk, all things maple. I'm your host, Adam Wild, director of the Eline Maple Research Forest and co-director of the Cornell Maple Program. Joining me is my colleague and co-host, Aaron Wightman. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Adam. It's great to be back in the studio. And as I was setting up my recording equipment, I was thinking about how we've been producing this podcast for 5 years now. It's really amazing how time flies.
Yeah, I would agree. It does seem like just yesterday that we started this project. But at the same time, a lot has changed over the past few years in the maple industry and in the world.
Right. When we first started the podcast, we were in the pandemic, and the world has been full of other big changes since then. In fact, change is the topic of the show today because change is coming to Sweet Talk and the Cornell Maple Program. As some listeners may already know, I'm leaving the Maple Program to pursue a different opportunity, and sadly, this will be my last show.
That is a sad announcement to hear, Aaron. And I've known this moment was coming for a while, but now that it's here, it feels bittersweet.
Bitter because it means more work for you for a while, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. Thanks. But we do have a transition plan and things will get sorted out soon. But it's also sweet because we did a lot of great projects over the years. So I thought for today's episode, we could talk about some of your work and what has changed maple sugaring during that time.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot. So I'm game for that. Shall we begin at the beginning?
Yeah, definitely. To start out, I think you've mentioned in previous episodes that you grew up tapping trees and making syrup with your family. But when did you actually start with the Cornell Maple Program, and what drew you to working in maple research and education? Because that's very different than just tapping trees on your own property and making syrup.
Yeah, it's true. It's different, but the two things are related. As you said, I grew up in Western New York. We had a small sugar bush, and it was just always such a special time of year. And we tried to keep up with the technology. We were never big-time producers, and it was never a large business endeavor, but we tried to keep pace with the changes in tubing and things like that. And it was really interesting to me on a lot of levels. But fast forward from that to 2016, I was searching for a new job. I had been teaching school for a while, and I saw the opening at the Cornell Maple Program, and I applied, and I was hired. So I started in 2016. And I was actually originally hired as a research assistant to help Steve Childs, who was the maple specialist at the time. So I came in and just started working with him.
That's great to be able to start under Steve Childs. He's left a big legacy in the Cornell Maple Program. So to have that mentorship, I'm sure was really helpful to get started within the industry.
Yeah, Steve had just such a breadth of knowledge. A lot of it was drawn from his experience. So one of the biggest things I got from Steve was just farmer know-how. And I really appreciate that now. But he had also tackled a lot of big questions in the industry. So being able to see how he had approached those big problems and the education resources he came up with to help maple producers improve their practices, that was really instructive to me. So I did that with him for a while, and then I was elevated to an extension associate role. So we were basically co-running the program toward the end. And then when Steve retired, I took over full-time in the role and was elevated to the level of a senior extension associate. So for the past few years, I've been the senior extension associate co-directing the Maple Program with you.
Yeah, that's great. As you reflect back on the past 10 years since you started with the Cornell Maple Program, what are some of the big things that have changed over the past 10 years?
Yeah, I guess I'll start by fully answering your last question, which I just realized I didn't, which is what drew me to working in maple research and education. I think there was more than just the love of it. Obviously, I enjoyed it as a child, but problem solving and working in natural systems to do problem solving is something that really appeals to me. Forests are a really unique and interesting natural system, and we're trying to do, in a gentle way, agriculture within that. And I think that's really stimulating, and that's what drew me to the position. And then to your next question, some of the big changes I've seen, there's been a lot of problem solving going on in the maple industry. It's been this really rapid pace of change. And so that's been really exciting to be here with an interest in maple syrup and trying to change how we do it to make it better at a time when there's all sorts of change happening on that front. One of the big things that's changed in the past 10 years is better tubing system design. I was around when these newer tubing systems came online in the early 90s, mid 90s, and we really learned a lot about how to use them better. And you've done a lot of that research up at the Eline too, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely I've done some of that work. We've joined together and collaborated and shared some data back and forth to help move that forward. But even in my time, that's been less than yours in the Maple program. I've seen a lot of changes in tubing design and layout and people realizing that really can make a difference in that production. I think a lot of the work that Steve did and you carried on after Steve retired was really looking at that tap hole sanitation, right? And trying to really promote and adopt that, I think, which has been a game changer in the maple industry over the last 10, 15 plus years.
Yeah, that is a big change. When these systems were originally conceived and put in the woods, we were sometimes we cleaned them, tried to clean them, but at the beginning of the season, the same old spout was going into the new tap hole. And the revelation that was causing a big impact on productivity through the work of people like Tim Perkins and Steve Childs, and then what we continued here at Cornell, we've just seen that makes a huge difference. Being here at the beginning of that 10 years ago and now seeing that it's almost universally adopted, that people do some type of tap hole longevity practice at the beginning of the season, I think is proof that this pipeline that we create from the university through extension and research out to producers really does work, at least sometimes. And that's had a big impact on production.
Definitely. And I think even, Joel touched on that in our last episode. One of the big things is that tap hole sanitation, and that helps with production overall.
Right. And another big area where I think there's been big changes is value-added products. When I moved into this position, Steve had finished the confections notebook, and he had done some of that background work in measuring invert sugars and how to get the ideal level of invert sugars to make certain confections. And that felt like really important information for confections. And I think it changed the level of quality. It changed the scale people were producing at. And that really opens up the door to large scale profitability. When I've done like net present value calculations around maple syrup, like, should I make maple syrup from this tree or should I cut it down and turn it into boards and sell it? It really is a toss up. But when you use the syrup to make and sell value added products, it all of a sudden is a much more valuable use of the tree, opening the door to larger scale value added products like cream, candy, and sugar just changes the economics so much. I think that's a really big game changer. And a lot more people have gotten in on that over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I can agree with that more. And I think that's something that's sort of unique. What you and then certainly Steve did as well at the Arnott Forest was working with the value-added products and new product development, looking beyond just a traditional maple syrup. And I think that's, a big contribution. So thank you for doing all of that. Of the kind of value-added products that you've been able to work on, which one's been your favorite over the years?
Ooh, that's a tough question.
And I guess when I say favorite is like, maybe not like I love tasting, I love eating that one the most, but which one was the most fun to work on?
Well, I guess part of it is the fact that we were able to take that to the next level by hiring Catherine, Dr. Monserrate, and also having Ailis Clyne working on these value-added products. We were really able to take it to the next level. And because of that, we made some really, truly delicious confections. The maple marshmallows were phenomenal. The dehydrated maple marshmallows were even better. The maple hazelnut cream was delicious, for sure, in all its variations. But if you're going to make me pick a favorite, I think I'm going to go back to one of the earliest projects. And it was Alicia's first project, as a matter of fact, and it was maple kombucha. I'm a big kombucha fan. I find it refreshing and delicious. And maple goes with kombucha so well in a variety of flavor combinations, including, I think it was a lemon thyme or a lemon rosemary maple kombucha. I can't remember which that Ailis made. And I think that was probably my favorite thing we ever made. And when I say we, I mean somebody else made it and I got to taste it.
I mean, that's the hardest part, is being the taste tester, right?
That's right. Hard job, but somebody has to do it.
Just the past 10 years, there has been a lot of change in the maple industry, but have there been newer challenges that emerged within that 10 years than what there was when you first came in?
Oh, definitely. And I think the challenges are bigger, the ones that are emerging now, than the problems we were solving before, because we were solving a lot of systems issues before, like how do we optimize systems? And the challenges that are coming are outside of our system. They're things like climate change, which is something we're going to have to adapt to. Right? So we'll have to take an adaptive approach. We can't take a prescriptive approach and say, okay, here's a new piece of technology that solves the climate issue. We're seeing that already with tap timing, that we have to adapt to it and we have to have strategies instead. of just having technology. So that's a big challenge. I know you're doing a lot of work in that with your climate sensor network and SAP refrigeration experiments and things like that. And just the challenge is going to be to keep expanding that toolbox to try to keep up with the problems that are created by warm weather during the sugaring season and also the weather that impacts the health of the forest. So that's a big challenge for sure.
And I think what's great is some of the work that we're doing independently we don't do it necessarily because we're thinking about climate change initially, have benefits that help us adapt to climate change. So things I'm thinking about are the work on tap hole sanitation and some of the sap chilling, which has some efficiency gains that you get, but also helps with adapting to warmer weather during the maple season. So I think there's some positive aspects, that things that we weren't necessarily attacking because of climate change, but help to adapt to that as well.
Yeah, tap hole sanitation was one with a pretty straight line, because what we were trying to do there is control microbes, and the effect of climate change is that it's warmer and the microbes proliferate faster. So the same method works. We just have to make sure that it works in a robust enough way to keep up with the impacts of climate change. That one's easy. One that's harder is forest health, like taking care of our woods, because it's not just the climate that's changing. We've got some pretty major changes in species composition, like the loss of ash trees, which were 20% of the biomass in our woods, and which contributed significantly to the biogeochemistry of the soil. Ash trees contribute a lot of calcium to the soil, and we're losing those. And what happens in their absence, we don't really know. So there's that, and a lot of other stressors that impact the forest. And I think that's an area where we really need to focus more effort, is forest health. And that's not a question just for the maple industry, obviously, but it's one where we have to pay attention to.
If we don't have our healthy forests, we don't have our maple trees, we're not going to have a maple industry, right? And so it's something we have to be extremely vigilant about and paying attention to.
Yeah, it takes a long time to grow a maple tree.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I've done some work trying to even look at, can we tap a tree at a younger age with smaller spouts and stuff? But it's challenging, especially if you're in an area with a short growing season. You need to make sure you have good, productive wood, new wood that's being put on every year to sustainably tap that tree year after year. And tapping a smaller tree can't always keep up with that production.
Absolutely. Yep. So that's something for sure to look at. And it's something I'll be paying attention to from outside the maple industry. I'm a forester by training. That's the background I come from. So hopefully I'll have some contact with this issue moving forward, and maybe even have some work that intersects with the maple industry. But hopefully it's something that we'll definitely make progress on in the future. I'd like to name one last challenge, and I think it's in markets. And this is a little outside of my area of expertise, but the maturing of maple markets is pretty impactful. The price that you can sell for in the bulk markets has changed and is kind of stabilized at a lower level. There's a lot of supply side pressure now, and that kind of intersects with some larger scale quality issues. These newer maple equipment makes maple syrup that's a little bit different in flavor, and there are some different quality issues. So dealing with large scale production and balancing out quality and supply and markets, those are all big challenges that will need to be addressed moving forward.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, if we look at the markets for maple syrup, they continue to increase, and we've seen even more growth since the pandemic. And so the markets seem to be strong for maple. But I think what you're kind of saying is there a potential that people are just trying to push out any syrup they can make just because the market is potentially there? And is that going to be lower quality syrup, right?
Right. I think as we switch to more like commodity style approaches with large scale production, we're going to encounter those issues, and definitely price point sensitivity for a lot of producers that aren't operating at large scale.
Yeah. And that is the downside, that, the market's still there, but the price really hasn't gone up. But the cost of inputs into producing has certainly gone up in just the last few years. And that, I think, is making it kind of a pinch point on producers, especially those smaller producers.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, it's a challenge that we haven't spent a lot of time at Cornell, but really glad that people like Mark Cannella at the University of Vermont Extension are doing that work and helping people stay profitable.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. It takes a whole team of different folks across different universities and things to help support the industry. As we think about all of these challenges, how has your role in Extension contributed to changes within the industry to meet some of these challenges?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I want to answer that question kind of carefully, because I think there's confusion about our role sometimes because we have an extension title, and the New York State extension system is a little bit complicated. because we're not county extension agents. We're campus-based specialists with an extension appointment. So that's complicated, but I think it gives us an opportunity to work at a really neat level in the industry. And, one of the things we do is we translate, we don't instruct. I mean, that isn't kind of the fundamental mission, is to instruct people. It's to translate the state-of-the-art knowledge at the university level, at the research level, into usable knowledge for our stakeholders, for maple producers. And one fun aspect of that is conducting applied research. So we get to use campus resources like the Food Venture Center or the laboratories that are here or the sensory program and things like that, and really knowledgeable experts in different departments here on campus to create good applied research that delivers solutions to problems people really encounter in the industry. And I think we've done a fair amount of work in that area. Tap hole sanitation is one of them. We're not microbial experts or tubing system experts, but we can talk to those people and we have the resources to do tests and come up with solutions. So that applied research aspect of it, I think, really contributed to progress in the maple industry, that we have those resources.
I think you've done, a great job of being able to connect with other folks on campus who are more experts in certain areas. Because, in the maple research, we do have to wear so many different hats, it seems like at times, and even as producers, we're times it feels like we're engineers laying out our tubing system and vacuum systems to food scientists and biologists and chemists and stuff like this. And so it's, we can't individually be the absolute expert in all those fields. So being able to tap into those other specialists on campus has really been helpful.
Yeah. And I know this isn't exciting, but a lot of the work I've done kind of behind the scenes here is really about institutional capacity for maple research. I've spent a lot of time just trying to align resources and make connections and create this ecosystem of resources on campus to try to move us to this next level of problem solving for a mature industry. Making those connections with the Food Venture Center and their pilot kitchen at Cornell Agritech and the food science program and things like that. Like just really aligning those resources and figuring out how to fund projects. As a senior extension associate, I feel like that's been my mission. It's one that I've been able to at least test and partially fulfill.
Yeah, I certainly want to compliment you on that because I think that's been great. When I started with the Maple program and certainly probably before you started, that there weren't a lot of other folks outside of the Maple program at Cornell that were doing anything with Maple. And I think you've been able to make those connections. And now there are a few other faculty that are in the food science and other areas that now have some grants that they're actually doing some projects that will support the maple industry. So that is certainly a great thing to have.
Yeah, and I think that's what we needed, were experts from outside of maple that were like true food science experts and folks like that to really up our game as an industry.
Yeah, and hopefully that will continue. And going back to kind of what you were saying about our role as campus-based specialists, and I think what's important that I know I've heard you say, and I try to remember too, is that, we're not here to tell producers what to do, but to provide information and tools for people to make their decisions for their situations. And because every maple production system is a little bit different, there's different ecosystems. And I think that's a really big role that I think you've tried to emphasize, in that there is differences that happen, within the climate variability we have across just the industry, from whether you're in West Virginia or you're in northern Maine or northern New York. The maple production can be a little bit different, and how we translate some of that research can be different into those different geographical regions.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between telling people what to do, which is guidance that usually has an expiration date, right? Because our knowledge is continuously changing. I mean, that's one way you could do it. You could go out and say, do it this way, or you can provide people with a decision-making framework and some tools so that they can go out there in the woods and assess the situation for themselves and have some background knowledge and understand the latest science and make their own decisions. And hopefully that's what we do with everything that we, the guidance we offer.
And with that in mind, how have you over the years tried to balance the idea of like the scientific rigor with actual producer realities? We know if you went and cleaned that line and it was absolutely perfect and you only put one tree on every single lateral line, that you'd have great production, but that, isn't always reality, right? So how do you balance that a little?
Yeah, so balancing the scientific rigor with the realities of being a maple producer trying to make money. trying to make syrup. I think our secret weapon at Cornell has always been that we run commercial sugar bushes too. So we're not just testing things in theory in a petri dish in a laboratory. We're out there doing it at scale, and we see the impact on our bottom line. Of course, we have a little grant money to soften the blow, but we have to make and sell syrup too. So that's been really helpful when I've tried to do things like scale food science guidance that's coming from experts that are used to dealing with large scale food processing type stakeholders and translating that down to what works at the sugar house or the farm level. That's a place where I've been able to do like that translation and that balance between scientific rigor and producer realities, because I get to take that same guidance back to my own sugar house and try to put it to use. It's been useful too when I've facilitated discussions about sanitizer regulation, which has been a hot topic lately between sugar makers and policymakers, right? Like trying to understand the technical terms, like is maple tubing a porous or non-porous food contact surface, things like that. And having that practical knowledge in the sugar house and also having the scientific background has really helped balance that out. So I think that's basically the main formula I've used to balance out the whole university versus what happens in the real world conflict that can arise, is just being in both worlds.
I really appreciate that you brought up that aspect that we're running these commercial sugaring operations as well, because it really gives us the opportunity to test these at a practical scale, and not that we're just running a few lines through some woods and the sap's just dumping on the ground because we're not actually making syrup out of it or things like that. We're going through every aspect and trying to test that of every aspect of a maple production operation, but we're also able, to understand where the challenge is within the industries, because we're having to deal with it as well. And so we see that and could try to adapt our systems for it, which is helpful. But the other thing I like, as you mentioned, is that, trying to implement that into our own systems. The old adage of do as I say, don't do as I do, right? But trying to make sure that I'm actually implementing some of the things that seem to make sense that I'm finding for my own research, of incorporating that into my maple production facility here at the Eline Forest. And, does this actually work when you're scaling it and everything? So I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Aaron, reflecting back, what are some of the bits of practical wisdom you've learned through experience in the field and in the sugar house?
That's actually one of the most gratifying parts of this job, has been those little victories in the woods or in the sugar house, the problem solving victories and the little bits of practical wisdom that you gain out of that. Sometimes I like to learn the hard way. So I've definitely done some of that type of learning through mistakes. But overall, it's just been really rewarding. And I've taken some bigger lessons away from that for sure. And the first one, and I think the most important one that everything else follows from, is to take the time to understand the system and how it works. We've got all this technology. If you choose to produce with that large scale technology, which not everyone does, but if you decide to go out there with the vacuum tubing system and reverse osmosis and high-tech evaporators and all this equipment, it's complicated. And in order to maximize the benefit you get out of that complicated and expensive equipment, it's important to understand the principles behind how it works and the mechanics behind how it works. And it might seem daunting, like, when you get that reverse osmosis machine delivered and it comes in pieces with no instructions, like that can seem complex, but there are all the resources out there to understand it. And I think just taking that little bit of time to go to the workshops, read the manuals, watch the YouTube videos, and really understand how the system works, then you'll be able to optimize it and take better care of it and have a much less frustrating experience over the long run.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The RO, I think, is a good example, because that's one that I think people don't always fully understand how it's working. But, if it breaks, how can you fix it if you don't know how it's really working? So I think that's pretty important. To lean into the equipment manufacturers too on some of that aspects as well, but lean into the folks who work in maple education to help with that also.
Mm-hmm.
Other kind of bits of wisdom that you learn maybe in setting up a system or anything like that you've found over the years?
Oh yeah, that's an easy one. And it's related to the point I just made, and it's do it right the first time. Like, you go out and you put tubing in the woods, something like that. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. So do it right the first time, for sure. But don't sweat it too much, I guess. So I'll temper that advice with don't stress too much, but try to do it right. And I'd say don't sweat it too much, because maple systems are pretty easy to reconfigure and change. But that's only true as long as you don't have to rebuild the whole thing. And if you build a system wrong the first time and you're not able to reconfigure it, you're going to be dealing with the consequences of that for a long time. So do it right the first time so you don't lose performance and deal with your past engineering mistakes for a long, long time. So that's definitely another one. And I'll jump to one last point, and that's to prioritize maintenance. These machines don't take care of themselves. Machines, in my experience, do not have any ability to self-heal or self-clean. You have to take care of them if you want them to perform for you. So when thinking about your operation and what size you want to operate at, what's your capacity, I think incorporating maintenance into that thinking, including end of the season maintenance, is really important. Think about what scale you can do things well at, and then plan to do it right and maintain your system over the long term, rather than chasing big numbers. Chase what's right for you and prioritize maintenance and understanding how your system works.
That's a great point. Just saying what works for you, I think is important, and I think the adage that I've been saying over the years is more taps doesn't always mean more sap or more syrup, but it always means more work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having that, I want to be the biggest producer in my neighborhood or whatever, have the most amount of all these number of taps as a bragging right. It's unfortunate that we use that, when we meet other sugar makers of how many taps do you have, right? And
yep.
But it's really more what works for you, what works for your family, your lifestyle, what makes you happy. And as you said, what's manageable? What can you do? How can you maintain that well, right? That's I think, number one priority, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that whole how many taps do you have question that's part of the syrup maker introduction, that really is a shame. The question should be, how good a sugar maker are you?
Yeah.
But we don't have a way to gauge that.
How many awards have you won with your syrup, right? Or something.
That's right. How good is your syrup? I mean, some of the worst syrup I've had has come from big producers, and I'm not picking on them. It just doesn't necessarily mean you're good just because you have a lot of taps. So yeah, for sure. Do it right.
And let me push back on that aspect a little bit. You say do it right. Like, how do you know how to do it right? When you talked about setting up a tubing system, how do you know how to do it right the first time? It can sometimes be challenging, right? When you have all these, several acres and all these trees and bushes and stuff around.
Yeah, do it right is probably an oversimplistic way to say it. I guess there's some general benchmarks we might want to think about in how we approach it when we set our standards. And one is, am I following food safety standards? There's one where we can do it right. Another one is quality. Like, am I building my operation around making good quality syrup? Am I going to put something on the market that will meet customers' expectations and meet my own expectations? Another one is efficiency. Like, am I designing an efficient system that bring good quality syrup to the sugar house and allow me to operate it without a lot of frustration and without a lot of breakdowns? And all those things are kind of informed by the resources you have, the time resources and the financial resources. So when I say do it right, I mean, pay attention to the standards that matter, and then don't bite off more than you can chew so that you can do it well.
Yeah, I'm glad you elaborated on that a little bit more. I think that's helpful to think about it in that way. The efficiency side of things is something that I've certainly worked on here at the Eline Forest over time. Making a system that is more enjoyable just to work within, that's not frustrating and, having to be cleaning up a syrup pan out in the mud and the cold,
right,
muddy ground or something. Those things that are, number one, that's not good food safety standards, right? But it's also just frustrating and not fun to work with. And so setting something up that in a system you can work within makes sugaring more fun and makes potentially better quality syrup as well.
Yep, exactly.
As you think about the maple industry, it's sometimes a tight-knit industry that's large, but not that big of an industry. And so are there folks in particular that you'd like to thank?
Yeah, Adam, there are definitely a lot of people I want to thank, but I think I'd broaden that statement to say beyond the industry, meaning commercial producers, to the larger maple community. And that means all the people that enjoy making and consuming syrup, because being in this specialist position has brought me into contact with people from across that whole spectrum. And I'm really grateful for a lot of those interactions, people that have helped me, or taught me new things, or expanded my understanding. And there's just too many people to list everyone. And I hope everyone knows how grateful I am for everything that contributed to the work we did. I'd like to give a special thanks to a couple of people, though. Steve Childs, my mentor, my friend, for many years. Really appreciated his guidance, and being able to work with him and learn from him was a real privilege. And Peter Smallage also, who supervised us during that time and created space for us to work in the university and at the Arnott Forest. Really grateful for Peter's support. Definitely want to thank my team, you, Adam, your predecessors, Joe Orifice, Mike Farrell, Keith, Otto up there. Really appreciated working with you guys at Eline, and my team at Arnott. I mean, you guys are the best. Robert Daniel, Mike Mobilio, Ailis Clyne, Catherine Monserrate. Thanks so much to you guys. You're my Maple family. You made everything possible. Really talented crew of people. I hope everyone knows that all the work that happened in the Maple program was made possible by them. Also like to thank Helen Thomas, the executive director of the New York State Maple Producers Association, who's been an ally and a supporter and just been great to us over the years and really supported our work, as well as Dan Weed, the current president of the Maple Producers Association. Just a great person. Really appreciate Dan's leadership. And I've had a few maple producers, quite a few really, that have helped me out over the years, but a few that have been especially interested in our work and helped a lot. And in that spirit, want to thank Dean Harvey for helping out with research and showing so much interest. And everyone at Murley's. You guys are great. Really appreciate your support and your activism in support of the Maple program. And Adam, there's one last person I'd like to thank. When we were at Cobleskill for the winter conference a few weeks ago, after one of my talks, I was approached by a man who was an ag teacher at a school, and he said he was a big fan of the show, and he thanked me for Sweet Talk, and he seemed so excited about the podcast, and it really made my day. And thanks to him, I really appreciate that boost and all the boost from all the people that have shown interest in our work over the years. So that's a lot of people, but I really am grateful to so many people who have helped us along the way.
It's a lot of people, but it's a few people amongst the many that you've come in contact within the maple community. I love that you use that phrase maple community and not maple industry, right? And that it is more of a community. And I know just in my experience is that we bumped into so many different people that we get to meet from, not just here in New York, but in so many other states as well. And I know I get encouragement and kind of fuel to keep going in the work that I do from meeting with those different producers and, sometimes learning from them and also maybe learning about challenges or ideas that they have. I think they help contribute to some of the work that we do, that's really important, having that connection with them. And I know one of my favorite things about being in the maple community has just been being able to meet every producer and learn from them over the years. And the more I meet, I think the better it is. So I'm sure you feel that way as well, Aaron. And I think it's been a really important part of the job for me, and I'm sure it is for you as well. And I'm sure there's more people that you would love to thank, but absolutely we can't thank every single person, unfortunately.
It helps that we're making maple syrup, right? Can you imagine if this podcast were about like wastewater management?
Nothing against wastewater management. It's important.
Very important. Yeah, probably more important than maple syrup, but people are less excited about it.
Yes, right. And it certainly helps, even I think beyond working with the maple community of the producers and equipment manufacturers and things like that, I think there's also an aspect that maybe people within the maple industry don't realize we interact with as much as the public and community outside of maple, and all of our producers do as well, but kind of educating the general public on maple and maple consumption, which is fairly easy to talk about and people love to learn about, right? Because again, it is maple and it's not wastewater.
That's right. Yeah. That really makes it easy and it makes it fun.
And, with that in mind, thinking about, that maple is something that's people enjoy to consume and to hear about. So beyond kind of the maple research and education aspect that you've been working in the last 10 years, I know you are still drawn to maple production and that you plan to continue tapping your own trees and making some syrup, maybe on a smaller scale. What is it about the maple industry that has kept you going for the past 10 years and will keep you going as you start tapping your own trees on your own now?
So you're setting me up for my big, final thought here as I close out my maple specialist career. That's a pretty big question, but for me, the answer is really easy. There's no contest there in my mind. So taking off my specialist hat, the big draw for maple sugaring is just experiencing it as a spring ritual and the chance to interact with nature and the cycles of nature that way. That's just so amazing to me. You go out into the woods in winter, and you've probably had this experience, especially if you go out at night on one of those starry nights where it's cold and the snow is crunching and glittering under your feet. And the sugar bush is like a cathedral, and we go out and we get this magical gift of sugar coming from the trees right as we're emerging out of winter, and just being out in woods. And as someone who has a forestry background and just is a deep appreciator of trees in general, as these just mysterious ancient beings, they live in our woods. They're living things that can be hundreds of years old. It's just an awe-inspiring experience for me. And that will always rise above all the exciting innovations that are happening in the maple industry for me. That will always be the most exciting thing about maple sugaring, is just the awesomeness of the experience of the rite of spring, being immersed in the rhythms of nature. And I hope that other people that love sugar making have a chance to reflect on that throughout the season and find joy in it and stay grounded in that ritual and that relationship with the land when they do their sugaring, and just really enjoy it.
Those are excellent points, Aaron. And even as me, as a researcher, there's some aspects that sometimes it's frustrating. We want to know every little thing about maple production and understanding, sap sweetness variability and flavor in different days. But sometimes I even step back and think, let's just enjoy what the trees provide us, right? Like, we do what we can as producers, but there's also that aspect that these are natural trees and these natural ecosystems that are providing the sap, and we can just enjoy what nature provides for us.
Yeah. When I leave Cornell, I'm going to be making maple syrup, but I'm doing it with buckets in a small sugar house with open sides so I can feel the wind and see the stars, and I'm going to enjoy it.
Hopefully stay warm doing that.
Maybe.
I think there was a advertisement from the Horseshoe Forestry Company in the late 1800s in the Adirondacks here, and one of their advertisements was that nature is the greatest chemist, and we can do no more than retain the flavor that nature provides for us. And I love that phrase, and it's such an old saying that they were using, over 100 years ago about maple syrup. Mm-hmm. I think even holds true even more today than it did then.
Yep. That's one of the great values of maple, and always will be. It's a gift from nature.
Well, as we close out this episode on those thoughts, Aaron, I want to let our listeners know that the Cornell Maple Program plans to keep the Sweet Talk Maple podcast going. For the short term, at least, I will be hosting the show solo for now, so bear with me. But this will hopefully change in the future. As we said in the beginning, change is coming, but I still hope to bring informative episodes to our listeners. Cornell University values the Cornell Maple Program and is dedicated to continuing the program, but there will be some time of transition until we can find someone who can attempt to replace you, Aaron, which is not going to be an easy task. But I personally want to thank you so much for all of the dedication and work that you've provided for the Cornell Maple Program, and a great colleague that you have been. It's been an honor and a pleasure to work with you over the years.
Well, I'm sorry to leave you, Adam, and sorry to leave you and our listeners hanging for the show. But I know the show will be great in the future, and I'll be tuning in for sure. And I hope everyone who enjoys this show will continue to listen.
Well, thanks, Aaron. And it's great to hear you won't be too far away. And thank you to all for listening. Join me next time for another episode of Sweet Talk, All Things Maple.
Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, All Things Maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.